It was an archive of pictures and texts which had accumulated over a few number of years, which were being reconfigured every time they entered a certain kind of exhibition space. So whether it was exhibition space within a residency program, or whether it was an exhibition in the context of a Kunstverein, or it was an exhibition in an art gallery space in Bombay. For me, the space was a certain kind of a site that I kind of reworked with every time I introduced my material, because my material got reworked every time very differently. So for me, it was also a certain, display was a method for me. Display was not in any sense showcasing. And that at some points I used to also kind of return to my architecture training in a very, very happy way, because in a sense one is trained to kind of see, and I remember some of the comments even at the Guild where people said, only an architect will think of all the photographs in a straight line, or all the photographs touching the edge. But it was just not that. It was also a certain way of constructing space again in the space you entered, and very often it was taking over the space. Like if there was a red wall, or if there was a cream wall, or if it was a mid-landing of certain shape and size, I never changed it, but I entered and worked with it. But in this kind of, this was the process that I saw, and I kind of imagined I was working with. But it was a process that also kind of which has also to do with the perception of how you work and how you operate that others have of you, is also a perception of then seeing you as an artist. And as I said, what began as actually a joke, which was with the director of the residency, who was also a very very senior kind of a colleague and friend, but also a mentor, who said that you cannot keep denying the question of method for me in that sense. So this was a point, and actually very frankly that point I had to just suspend it and leave it at a certain point in time and not go back to it. But it was a point that had a journey of about 4 or 5 years, which obviously made me think about the work in certain ways, and about spaces in certain ways, because it also happens that one is kind of in the other kind of work that I do, one is always in conversation, in engagement with what one would call the art world, with kind of artists, with thinkers, with writers, with critics, and that's the space of your engagement, that's the space of your thinking. And then there's a space of practice of a certain in a certain definition that you're pushed into, and you want to kind of not be in it for certain in this panel. So I just leave it at that. Thanks.
Exists in a conversation about art, and that the art world is principally and primarily a conversation. And of course, once you've said that, you're also implying that it's a conversation that comes with various institutions that define, values, help circulate, and so forth. Art, right? Or what is called art. So, thank you everybody for having put these questions into a relay, but I think maybe we do one more round where we revisit each of the speakers. And I'll go back to Shiv Kumar actually. There were many strands in your wonderful presentation, but one of them had to do with ambition. So could you speak a little more about, and the 3 figures that you spoke of, or the 4 figures that you spoke of, each had a slightly different sort of ambition in a slightly different context, ranging from the particularity of where does this drawing go, to the question of how do I create an iconographical program for the nation. So, do you want to reflect a little bit on the role of ambition in how an artistic career gets driven?
Well, I think it's a central thing that without that sort of ambition, whether it is an artistic career or even an art historical career, I mean, nothing gets driven. I think that's a very important thing. But and it is, as Gieve was trying to say, somewhat historically, perched. If you are to director, of course, you will be trying to think in a post-Titianist way. So your ambitions get somewhat formulated and directed by that position, historical position. But what happens, maybe even as Tintoretto grows older, there'll be somebody else coming in. So the question is, then what do you do? And what do you do with your ambition? I think the anxiety really comes at that point. The first part, it's much easier to handle. The second part is a little more difficult. And it is at this juncture, I think each artist has to make decisions. The first one is actually made for him. And most of the artists that I worked on decided more like Sudhir was saying that, well, it doesn't really matter. I go ahead and do what is, I think, has to be done. Now, I personally would think, and I might add another figure to this, because who carries that tradition a little further, that is Subramanian. I mean, who also takes many of these ideas and then tries to get, but he knows that he's living in an entirely different historical space, and where the goalposts are changing faster, and you cannot really think at that point that, well, I don't really bother. But what probably the kind of choice he makes, I think, and probably it's a wise choice, is also to see, I mean, you keep working with that, but what happens around you, in a sense, you take cognizance of that. And you have to redefine your own goals in terms of that. Now, in a sense, when we went to college to do art history, it was similar. We were all, I mean, in India at least, within the framework of modernism, and that is where we kind of worked. And by the time we started working, writing, there was an entirely big shift. And there is this question, what do you do, in a sense? This is an anxiety I suppose everyone faces, not necessarily artists, but also writers, art historians, critics, architects. I mean, I'm sure everyone faces this at that point. So the choice is also to a certain extent, like there is art history, there is new art history, critical art history, and so you have to make a choice. I mean, it's similar to that of the artist. I mean, Tintoretto making choice in a late stage. So how do we negotiate that? I suppose the best way to do that, as far as I can see, is probably, I mean, all my training, all my kind of work, I can't think about giving it up. But at the same time, what new things are emerging? I mean, I cannot shut my eye on those things. But those new things probably will make me think about what I am doing in my own area and reformulate my own goals a little bit, and maybe see where can it draw its strength from further. So I suppose, I mean, because I cannot really, being an outsider, I can't really think about how an artist does, but I can only guess. And from the way that I tend to do myself, I think this is what artist also does. And it is at this juncture, probably the real choices are made. And also you then, as both of them are trying to say yourself a little more better. I mean, you belong both to, in relation to people who were before you, I mean, who at one point you might think early in your career you are leaving behind. I mean, Tintoretto should have thought more respectfully, with less strategy, and more honestly about vision in his later life. So I think this is also a wonderful thing that this whole experience teaches you. I mean, to be a little less, I mean, dismissive of things, to be a little more serious about things. So this experience, and I might end with a little anecdote. The first time and the only time I met Vinod Bihari, this was the kind of question. He said, how do you see me? I mean, do you see me as a modernist or as a traditionalist? So I didn't want to, because he was quite, I was a very young boy and he was kind of thing. So I didn't really try to answer that, but put it back to him. And he said, well, when you are young and if you don't think you are a modernist, and when you're old, and if you don't realize that you're part of a tradition, then you are not wise.
Thank you for that truly wise and salutary set of observations. It leads me to think of something Yeats said towards the end of his own life. He said, I'm not a reactionary as an old man because I was not a radical as a young man. You know? So evidently some people are blessed with continuing wisdom, but the rest of us must quest on. So Sudhir, if you could maybe continue with this rich vein of discussion that Shiv Kumar has just opened up. How does it look from where you are in terms of your own sense of the context you inhabit and your own shifting relationships with those who went before and those who you now see as young practitioners? And also maybe if you could respond to a question about how for you it's no longer necessarily about changes in your own artistic language, but it's also about a shift in the role you play as a cultural producer. Because in recent years you've played much more the role of the pedagogue, the curator, even in the best sense, I think, the popularizer of the contemporary. So do you want to respond to these questions?
I think I'll start with the question of being a modernist and then seeing the emergence of postmodern, being at thinking part sometimes that yes, one belongs to the postmodern, sometimes thinking that no, probably one belongs to the modern, and trying to resolve that kind of crisis. I think it connects with the kind of thing that Gieve was pointing to, the problem about having standards and Gieve's perception that standards have been we no longer holding to any, and we have not evolved new standards, and we are no longer holding on to older standards. I think definitely the way in which you can assess, or the way in which you can think what is significant has changed. And it would be interesting to, for our generation, if we went and showed our work to either Akbar or Tayyab, we knew that though there were differences, they rejected kind of narrative. You're not interested in that. But still, their assessment would be very significant for us, for our growth. And one could rely on what kind of assessment they had. Now, that no longer holds, I think, between the next generations, in a sense, because the standards are changing so rapidly that it becomes difficult, and that causes the appearance that everything is being swept aside. But I'm sure that within each artist, they are trying to hold on, they are trying to evolve the standards. But the question is, can one reach some kind of a communal understanding of what these standards are? They may be multi-centric. There's no longer one grand narrative which is dictating these standards. There may be multiple ways in which to formulate them. But there is a need for this, and I think the generation that has come after us has been in a much more difficult position to assess their own work than we were, because, as you said, we did belong to a tradition, and if you don't now belong to, or you make a choice, and it's only a personal choice that I identify with this, then what legitimizes that? So that's the kind of, those are the kinds of thoughts. One other thought about what Kaiwan said, to approach that in a reverse way, to approach what your position was, that you entered this artistic space and then withdrew from it, and you did not want to be identified as an artist. But there are today many who enter the art space with the purpose of, they come from outside and they think that it is absolutely legitimate to enter this space and bring other standards. And as Rakhi was saying, for the way in which design standards have in fact infiltrated into the art space and art dialogue, and the way in which a project, should be more in a position to elaborate, but it was a fine point that artists now have projects and they know beforehand that this is what is to be achieved, and therefore, as you say, 1, 2, 3, that's the way they go about it. So, what is this new kind of thing that? Just questions.
Very important questions. Thank you, Sudhir.
Gieve, this brings me to you now, and I think some of these questions will circulate again. But I was very struck by this motif of self-doubt that pervaded much that you said. On the one hand, a very confident model of inspiration, strategy, then you kind of decrypted each of these. But how do you, as a practitioner, and also because you're a practitioner in several disciplines, you're a poet, you're a playwright, and you're a painter as well, how do you negotiate that middle path between the extremes? Because that also speaks to what Kumar said a little earlier about obviously not throwing away all the resources that you have acquired and created for yourself, but at the same time not closing your eyes to something new. What does it mean to then open yourself up to a new set of criteria? Because that again that also speaks to what Sudhir has just said. What do we do with stimulations that clearly need new strategies of reading and new criteria? And to ask a blunt, banal question, do you find that it is worth your time?